Kansas City, Missouri, April 6, 1950. 7:23 a.m. A cleaning woman named Dorothy Jones unlocked the front door of the First Ward Democratic Club on Truman Road, just east of downtown Kansas City. She carried her mop bucket and a ring of keys, preparing for another morning routine she'd performed 100 times before. The building was quiet. Too quiet. She walked through the main hall, past campaign posters peeling from the walls, past folding chairs still arranged from Tuesday's precinct meeting. Then she saw the blood. It had pooled beneath the door to the inner office, seeping into the hallway's tile grout. Dorothy dropped her bucket. Water spread across the floor, mixing with what had leaked from the room beyond. She didn't scream. She just stood there, frozen, until her hands started shaking enough that she couldn't hold her keys anymore. When the police kicked in the door 7 minutes later, they found Charles Binaggio and Charles Gargata sitting in chairs positioned directly in front of a life-sized portrait of President Harry S. Truman. Both men had been shot in the head at close range. The murder weapon, a .38 caliber revolver, was gone. Shell casings were carefully collected from the floor. There were no signs of struggle. The office safe stood open and undisturbed, cash still visible inside. Binaggio's body was slumped forward, his expensive suit soaked with blood. His eyes were open. His right hand rested on the arm of the chair, as if he'd been sitting calmly when the first bullet entered his skull just above his left ear. Gargata had fallen sideways but remained in his seat, his fedora somehow still on his head. The back wall behind them was sprayed with blood, brain matter, and bone fragments. The symbolism was impossible to miss. Kansas City's most powerful political boss had been executed in his own office, beneath the watchful eyes of a president whose political machine had launched his career, in a building that represented the very heart of Democratic Party power in Missouri. The message wasn't subtle. It wasn't meant to be. This was what happened when you promised the mafia you could deliver a city, and then failed to keep that promise. To understand how Charles Binaggio ended up dead in that chair, you need to understand Kansas City in the 1930s and 40s, a city that functioned less like a democracy and more like a criminal enterprise with a charter. Tom Pendergast built it first. Pendergast was the Democratic Party boss who controlled Kansas City politics for nearly 3 decades, from the 1920s until his conviction for tax evasion in 1939. His machine operated with mathematical precision. Control the precinct captains, control who gets city jobs, control who wins elections. He registered thousands of ghost voters. He paid poll workers to stuff ballot boxes. He ensured that loyal ward healers got their families on city payroll, that construction contracts went to friendly companies, that police looked the other way when necessary. Under Pendergast, Kansas City became America's wide-open town. Gambling flourished openly. Brothels operated without interference. Illegal liquor flowed freely during Prohibition and continued flowing after repeal. The Italian mob, originally scattered smaller gangs, consolidated under this protective umbrella into what would become the Civella crime family. When Pendergast fell in 1939, convicted and imprisoned, a power vacuum opened. The question wasn't whether organized crime would continue controlling Kansas City politics. The question was who would serve as the next bridge between the mob and City Hall. Charles Binaggio saw his opportunity. Born in 1909 to Italian immigrant parents, Binaggio grew up in Kansas City's North End, a predominantly Italian neighborhood where legitimate business and organized crime existed in comfortable proximity. He was smart, ambitious, and understood instinctively how power worked in the city. By his 20s, he ran a successful bail bond business and a liquor distributorship, both legitimate fronts that brought him into constant contact with criminals, cops, and politicians. He cultivated relationships carefully. He did favors. He remembered names and faces. He showed up at weddings and funerals. He contributed generously to Democratic Party causes. By the early 1940s, Charles Binaggio had positioned himself as the indispensable man, the person who could deliver votes, money, and influence to politicians while protecting the interests of organized crime. The Civella family recognized his value immediately. The Civellas were different from the flashy East Coast families that dominated headlines. Nicholas "Nick" Civella became the boss in the mid-1940s, taking control after years of careful consolidation. Born in Kansas City in 1912, he'd grown up in the rackets, working his way through gambling operations, labor extortion, and narcotics distribution. But Nick understood something that many mobsters didn't. The real money wasn't in street crime. The real money was in controlling the infrastructure, the unions, the politicians, the businesses that made a city function. He was patient, methodical. He avoided unnecessary violence. He invested profits into legitimate businesses and cultivated relationships with powerful people who could be useful later. While other mob bosses sought attention and respect through flamboyant displays, Nick Civella built his empire quietly, carefully, ensuring every piece was locked into place before moving to the next opportunity. By 1946, the Civella organization controlled the Teamsters Local 41, which gave them leverage over every trucking company and warehouse in Kansas City, most of the illegal gambling operations in Missouri and parts of Kansas, several legitimate businesses including vending machine companies, liquor distributorships, and construction firms, a significant portion of the city's bookmaking operations, growing interests in narcotics distribution along I-70, the major east-west highway corridor. But Nick's greatest coup was his connection to the national mafia establishment. Through relationships with crime families in Chicago, Detroit, and Milwaukee, the Civella organization became a junior partner in the most profitable criminal enterprise in American history, the Las Vegas casino Skim. Starting in the late 1940s and continuing through the 1970s, mob-controlled casinos in Las Vegas systematically underreported their profits and skimmed the difference before it could be taxed or recorded. The money was divided among several Midwest crime families, with the Civellas receiving a substantial cut. It was millions of dollars annually. Money that flowed through Kansas City, was laundered through legitimate businesses, and enriched everyone who played ball. To protect this empire, Nick Civella needed political cover. He needed someone who could ensure the Kansas City Police Department wouldn't interfere with operations. He needed someone who could deliver favorable city contracts to mob-controlled companies. He needed someone who could control local prosecutors and judges. He needed Charles Binaggio. The partnership worked beautifully at first. Binaggio rebuilt the Democratic Party's first ward organization, the same ward Pendergast had controlled. He placed loyal men in key positions throughout city government. He ensured that police captains understood which gambling operations were untouchable. He facilitated the flow of money from the Civella organization into political campaigns, disguised through elaborate contribution schemes and cash payments. In return, the mob protected Binaggio's political interests. They delivered votes when needed. They provided muscle to intimidate rivals. They funded his lifestyle, the expensive suits, the Cadillac, the suite at the Hotel Phillips where he conducted business away from his wife and children. By 1948, Charles Binaggio was arguably the most powerful man in Kansas City politics. He controlled enough delegates at the state Democratic Convention to influence gubernatorial races. He had relationships with congressmen and senators. He spoke regularly with Democratic National Committee members. Newspapers called him the political boss of Kansas City, though he held no elected office and operated entirely through proxies and influence. But Binaggio's ambition exceeded his judgment. In 1948, he convinced Nick Civella and the national mob leadership that he could deliver something unprecedented, the complete legalization of gambling in Missouri. Binaggio argued that with the right governor in office, someone the organization controlled, they could push legislation through the state assembly legalizing casino gambling in Kansas City. It would be Las Vegas in the Midwest, billions of dollars in legal gambling revenue, and the Civella family would control it all. The mob invested heavily in Binaggio's plan. They provided hundreds of thousands of dollars for the gubernatorial campaign of Forrest Smith, who won election in November 1948 with Binaggio's backing. Everyone understood the deal. Smith would push gambling legalization once safely in office. Then Smith got cold feet. Facing pressure from reform groups, religious organizations, and federal investigators increasingly interested in Kansas City corruption, Governor Smith distanced himself from Binaggio. The gambling legislation never materialized. The promises Binaggio had made, promises backed by mob money, turned out to be empty. Nick Civella had a problem. The national mafia families who'd invested in the Kansas City operation expected returns. When those returns didn't materialize, they looked for explanations. More importantly, they looked for accountability. Federal heat was increasing. The Kefauver Committee, a special Senate committee investigating organized crime, was preparing hearings that would put Kansas City's mob connections under national scrutiny. In late 1949, word came down from Chicago and the commission. Kansas City needed to cool down. The partnership with Binaggio was drawing too much attention. Either he needed to deliver on his promises and reduce federal interest, or he needed to go. Binaggio tried. He met with politicians, promised the gambling legislation was still coming, begged for more time. But everyone could see the truth. He'd overreached. He'd promised something he couldn't deliver. And in the world of organized crime, that kind of failure had only one consequence. The last months of Charles Binaggio's life were spent in growing desperation. He knew the mob was unhappy. He received messages through intermediaries, polite at first, then increasingly blunt. His phones were tapped by federal agents monitoring his conversations. His political allies began distancing themselves, sensing his vulnerability. His wife noticed he'd become quiet, distracted, constantly looking over his shoulder. In March 1950, Binaggio met with Tony Gizzo, Nick Civella's underboss and enforcer. The meeting took place at a restaurant on the Country Club Plaza. According to an FBI informant who later testified, Gizzo told Binaggio, "You've got 30 days to fix this situation. Deliver the governor or deliver yourself out of Kansas City." Binaggio tried one final play. He arranged a meeting with Governor Smith for early April, planning to pressure the governor into supporting gambling legislation. The meeting never happened. Smith's office called to cancel the day before. On April 5, 1950, Charles Binaggio spent the evening at the First Ward Democratic Club. He was there with Charles Gargotta, his closest associate and the organization's muscle. They were supposedly reviewing voter registration lists for upcoming precinct elections. Several witnesses saw them arrive around 10 p.m. The building emptied gradually, ward heelers leaving for the night, precinct workers heading home. At some point after midnight, two men entered the building. No one saw them arrive. No one heard shots. The building's thick walls and the late hour ensured that. What happened inside that office occurred in silence, professionally, and without witnesses. Based on the crime scene evidence, forensic experts later reconstructed the sequence. Binaggio and Gargotta were likely expecting the visitors. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence they'd tried to flee or fight. They sat in their chairs, probably believing this was another meeting, another negotiation, another chance to explain themselves. The shooters likely stood behind them, close enough that powder burns were visible on the victims' skulls. 2 shots to Binaggio's head, 2 shots to Gargotta's head. Quick, professional, final. The killers arranged the bodies carefully. They positioned the chairs so the victims faced President Truman's portrait. They left the office safe open, a message that this wasn't about money. They collected their shell casings methodically. Then they walked out the same way they came, disappearing into Kansas City's dark streets. 12 hours later, Dorothy Jones found them. The murder of Charles Binaggio became front-page news across America. Life magazine ran photographs of the crime scene, including images of Binaggio's body beneath Truman's portrait. The symbolism was too perfect for journalists to ignore. The corruption of democratic machine politics literally bleeding out beneath the image of the party's leader. Editorial writers called it the most significant political assassination in American history. Some compared it to the fall of Tom Pendergast, another symbol of Kansas City's corrupt partnership between politics and crime. The Kansas City Police Department launched an investigation that would last decades without producing a single arrest. They questioned hundreds of witnesses. They pursued dozens of leads. They brought in FBI assistants. Nothing led anywhere. Everyone who might have known something stayed silent. The Code of Omerta, the Mafia's sworn code of silence, held absolutely. Several theories emerged about who ordered the hit. Some believed Nick Civella acted alone, eliminating a political liability. Others suspected the Chicago outfit had given the order, protecting their Las Vegas Skim operation from federal scrutiny. A third theory held that multiple families had jointly approved the execution, a commission decision to send a message about the consequences of failure. The truth probably involved all three. The national mafia leadership wanted the Kansas City situation resolved. Nick Civella needed to demonstrate he could control his territory. The Chicago outfit needed assurance their Vegas operation wouldn't be compromised by Kansas City's political corruption investigations. Binaggio's death accomplished all these objectives simultaneously. But the murder had unintended consequences. The public execution of Kansas City's political boss brought exactly the kind of federal attention the mob had hoped to avoid. The Kefauver Committee made Kansas City a priority target in their organized crime hearings. Senators came to town, subpoenaed witnesses, exposed the intricate connections between the Civella family and city government. The hearings were televised nationally, bringing Kansas City's corruption into American living rooms. Local reform movements gained momentum. The Citizens Association, a good government organization, successfully pushed for police department reforms and civil service protections that reduced mob influence over city hiring. Federal prosecutors began building RICO cases against organized crime figures, using Binaggio's murder as evidence of the mob's control over Kansas City politics. Nick Civella survived the scrutiny, but his empire never fully recovered. The blatant political control the Civella family had enjoyed under Binaggio's protection was gone. They were forced back into traditional organized crime activities, gambling, loan sharking, labor racketeering, more profitable than political influence but also more vulnerable to prosecution. The Las Vegas Skim continued for another 30 years, generating hundreds of millions for the Kansas City mob. But the organization operated under constant federal surveillance. The FBI opened a permanent Kansas City organized crime task force. Wiretaps, informants, and undercover operations gradually dismantled what Pendergast and Binaggio had built. April 6, 1950. 3:47 p.m. Nick Civella sat in his modest home on Armour Boulevard, reading afternoon newspapers with photographs of Binaggio's body splashed across the front page. He said nothing. He made no phone calls. He received no visitors. To anyone watching, and federal agents were always watching, he appeared completely unconcerned with the murder of Kansas City's political boss. This was his genius and his curse. Nick Civella understood that real power operated invisibly, that the most dangerous men were the ones nobody noticed, that survival meant avoiding attention, while others attracted it fatally. He'd learned from Pendergast's mistakes. He'd learned from Binaggio's mistakes. He knew that the partnership between organized crime and politics could only survive if maintained subtly, carefully, without the bravado and public displays that inevitably drew federal interest. But he also understood that violence, when necessary, needed to be spectacular enough to prevent future problems. Binaggio's murder accomplished that perfectly. It reminded every politician, every cop, every businessman in Kansas City who really held power, not the mayor, not the city council, not the police chief, the men who could kill with impunity and walk away without consequences. For a while, it worked. The Civella organization remained powerful through the 1950s and 60s. They expanded their Las Vegas interests. They controlled Kansas City's Teamsters locals. They corrupted politicians more carefully, with less visibility than Binaggio's crude methods. Nick Civella himself became a shadowy legend. Everyone knew his name, but few could prove what he actually did. Then the RICO statutes arrived. The Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, passed in 1970, changed everything. It allowed prosecutors to target entire criminal enterprises rather than individual crimes. It made being a member of the mafia itself illegal. It authorized asset forfeiture, lengthy prison sentences, and immunity deals that turned mobsters into informants. In 1981, Nick Civella was convicted on RICO charges and sentenced to 4 years in federal prison. He was released in 1983, his health broken, his organization decimated by defections and prosecutions. He died in 1983 at age 71, the last of Kansas City's great mob bosses. His funeral was attended by 14 people. Today, the building where Charles Binaggio died no longer exists. The First Ward Democratic Club was demolished in the 1970s, replaced by a parking lot, then later by a small commercial building housing a check-cashing service and a cellular phone store. There's no historical marker, no plaque, nothing to indicate that one of the most significant events in American organized crime history occurred on that spot. Kansas City itself has moved on. The wide-open town of the Pendergast era is long gone. The Civella family's criminal empire is history. The Democratic Party machine that once controlled city politics was reformed, weakened, eventually replaced by more conventional political structures. The city is cleaner now, more prosperous, less corrupt, though longtime residents will tell you that some things never completely disappear, just become better hidden. But Binaggio's murder left a legacy that extends beyond Kansas City. It demonstrated that even the most powerful political bosses were ultimately expendable when they failed the mob. It showed federal investigators how deeply organized crime had penetrated American politics, spurring reforms and investigations that would eventually dismantle many of the traditional mafia families. It proved that corruption's greatest weakness wasn't law enforcement, it was the criminals' own internal discipline, their willingness to murder partners who became liabilities. The photographs from that crime scene, Binaggio slumped beneath Truman's portrait, became iconic images of mid-century American corruption. They appeared in textbooks, documentaries, museum exhibits about organized crime. They represented a specific moment in American history, when the partnership between political machines and criminal organizations finally became visible to the public, shocking enough to demand change. Charles Binaggio believed he could control both worlds, the political and the criminal, simultaneously. He thought he could broker power without becoming subject to its consequences. He was wrong. The mob he served killed him without hesitation when he became a liability. The politicians he empowered abandoned him when federal scrutiny became uncomfortable. He died alone in a chair, betrayed by everyone, his promises unfulfilled, his ambitions destroyed. The cleaning woman who found his body, Dorothy Jones, gave one interview to the Kansas City Star 3 days after the murder. She was asked what she thought when she first saw the blood seeping under the door. "I thought somebody had finally paid up," she said. "This whole city's been paying for years, paying taxes, paying bribes, paying protection money. I guess Mr. Binaggio finally got his bill." She never spoke about it again. There's a particular irony to Charles Binaggio's death that becomes clear only with historical distance. He was murdered in April 1950. The Kefauver Committee hearings began in May 1950. If Binaggio had survived just 6 more weeks, he would have been subpoenaed to testify before the Senate about Kansas City's organized crime connections. He would have faced a choice: testify and betray the mob, or refuse and face contempt charges and prison. Either way, his political career would have ended. The mob that killed him probably knew the hearings were coming. They certainly knew that federal investigators were circling. Binaggio's execution wasn't just punishment for failing to deliver gambling legalization. It was preemptive damage control. Dead men can't testify. Dead men can't cut immunity deals. Dead men can't reveal the intricate financial connections between Kansas City's crime families and Las Vegas casinos. Nick Civella understood this perfectly. When the Kefauver Committee eventually came to Kansas City, they found plenty of evidence of corruption, but many of the key witnesses were dead, disappeared, or suddenly unable to remember anything useful. The investigation produced headlines but few convictions. The mob's internal security, enforced through murder, proved more effective than any legal defense. This was the fundamental equation that governed organized crime in mid-century America. Loyalty, enforced by fear. Silence enforced by death. Power maintained through the willingness to kill anyone who endangered the organization. Binaggio forgot this equation. He thought his political connections made him untouchable. He thought the mob needed him more than he needed the mob. He was sitting in his chair, beneath Truman's portrait, when he learned otherwise. One final detail haunts the Binaggio murder. The Kansas City police found a half-written letter in Binaggio's jacket pocket. It was addressed to Governor Smith, dated April 5, 1950, the day before the murder. The letter was never finished. It read, "Dear Governor, I understand your concerns about the current political situation and the attention our previous discussions have generated. I want to assure you that I remain committed to supporting your administration and the party's interests. I believe we can find a solution that satisfies everyone involved, and I would appreciate the opportunity to discuss this matter with you personally at your earliest convenience. The future prosperity of Kansas City depends on our ability to work together effectively, and I remain confident that—" The letter ended mid-sentence. Forensic analysis suggested Binaggio wrote it the evening of April 5th, probably while sitting at his desk in the First Ward Democratic Club. He likely planned to finish and mail it the next morning. Instead, he was murdered that night, the unfinished letter still folded in his pocket. The letter reveals Binaggio's fundamental miscalculation. Even as the mob was preparing to execute him, he still believed he could negotiate, could find a political solution, could talk his way out of the corner he'd backed himself into. He thought words mattered more than actions, that promises could substitute for results, that he could charm his way to safety. He couldn't. The mob didn't want negotiations, or discussions, or reassurances. They wanted either success or silence. Binaggio couldn't deliver success, so they delivered silence. Permanently. Kansas City, Missouri, April 6, 2025. 75 years after Charles Binaggio's murder, only a handful of people in Kansas City remember the story. Occasionally, local historians give lectures about the Pendergast machine and the Civella family. Sometimes graduate students write theses about political corruption in the mid-century Midwest. Very rarely, aging former FBI agents who worked Kansas City organized crime cases share stories about the glory days when the mob really ran things. But mostly, the story is forgotten. The building is gone. The witnesses are dead. The Democratic Party machine that enabled Binaggio's power was reformed and replaced decades ago. The Civella organization collapsed under federal prosecution in the 1980s. The wide-open gambling that defined Pendergast's Kansas City is now legal and regulated and boring, generating tax revenue instead of corruption. What remains is a cautionary tale about what happens when criminals and politicians become too comfortable together. When corruption becomes so normalized that everyone forgets it's corruption. When power operates so openly that it eventually must either reform or destroy itself spectacularly. Charles Binaggio chose destruction. Or perhaps, destruction chose him. Either way, he ended where all political bosses who forget their place eventually end. Dead in a chair, promises unfulfilled, allies vanished, his blood seeping into floorboards while the city he thought he controlled moved on without him. The portrait of President Truman that hung behind Binaggio's body was donated to the Truman Presidential Library after the murder. It hangs there still, in a storage room visitors never see, a footnote to a presidency and a symbol of an era when American politics and organized crime were so intertwined that sometimes you couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. The blood has been cleaned away. The building has been demolished. The men who ordered the killing are long dead, but the lesson remains. In the partnership between criminals and politicians, the criminals always win. Because they're the only ones willing to do what winning actually requires.